She thought no one would stand up until he did. No one expected the storm that morning in room 214. The hum of old fluorescent lights filled the silence, and warm air hissed from a rusty vent in the corner. It was just another ordinary day in seventh grade English, until it wasn't. Zanaya Brooks sat quietly in the third row. Her long braids were tied back, hands resting neatly on her copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. She was the kind of student teachers usually appreciated, soft-spoken, respectful, always prepared. But with Ms. Van Holt, it never seemed to matter. "Let's pick up where we left off yesterday," the teacher said, flipping through her worn copy of the book. "Zanaya, you read." Zanaya began softly. Her voice was steady, each word deliberate. She didn't just read, she felt the story. But before she could even finish the sentence, Ms. Van Holt's voice cut through the air. "Zanaya," she interrupted, loud enough to freeze the room. "This isn't one of those street corner rap battles. Try sounding like someone who's actually educated." The room shrank. A few students blinked. One whispered "damn" under his breath. Another suddenly found something urgent in his backpack. But no one laughed. It wasn't funny. It didn't even feel like a joke. It felt cruel. Zanaya's voice died. Her eyes stayed fixed on the page, though the words had blurred. Her shoulders tensed. Her fingers clenched the desk. And Ms. Van Holt just stood there, arms folded, gaze unbothered, like she'd corrected a mispronounced word, not humiliated a child in front of her peers. Then came the sound no one expected, the slow, deliberate scrape of a chair from the back corner of the room. Omari Penn stood up, tall, quiet, always sketching in the margins of his notebook. Omari was the kind of kid most teachers barely noticed. But not today. He didn't raise his hand, didn't wait for permission. "You don't talk to people like that," he said evenly, eyes locked on Ms. Van Holt. The room froze again. "She reads better than most kids in here. And you know it. You only said that because she's black." The teacher blinked. For a moment, her confidence wavered. Zanaya didn't look up, but her shoulders shook slightly, her grip tightening. From the front, someone let out a low whistle. Not mocking, just disbelief. No one had ever seen this happen before. Omari didn't back down. He didn't yell. That made it more powerful. "What you said to Zanaya was disrespectful and racist, and you know it." Miss Van Holt stiffened. "I'll see you after class," she said, trying to reclaim control, but it didn't land. Then another voice chimed in. Joey Gant from the second row. She didn't stand, but she said quietly, "He's right." Then came a third voice. Dave Ruckley, always half asleep in class, mumbled, "That was wild, Miss Van Holt." It wasn't a rebellion, but it was enough to shake her. She turned to the board, picked up the marker, and started writing, but her hand trembled. Zanaya finally lifted her head. Her face was still, but her eyes spoke volumes. Pain, gratitude, maybe even guilt, for being the reason someone else had to speak up. Omari met her eyes for a second, then sat down, calm, silent, as if he hadn't just changed everything. No one read after that. Ms. Van Holt handed out a worksheet, busy work, clearly unplanned. Her voice stayed level, but she didn't look at anyone. And Zanaya? She didn't fill in a single answer. She just sat, pencil in hand, unmoving. Stuck. When the bell rang at 9:50, it sliced through the air. Students filed out in silence. Some patted Omari on the shoulder. Quick, discreet. Joy waited by the door for Zanaya, walking beside her without saying a word. Ms. Van Holt called out, "Omari." He paused. "I'll need to speak with your parents." He didn't flinch. "You should probably speak with hers first." Then he turned and walked out, sketchbook under his arm, swallowed into the hallway crowd. By lunchtime, the story had traveled. Whispers in the cafeteria, texts in the gym. It wasn't just about what had been said. It was about what had finally been said back. And in the teacher's lounge, Ms. Lantry stirred her coffee. "Did you hear about Van Holt's class?" Mr. Whitaker, hunched over his salad, grunted. "Yeah, bold move. Kid called her out." "She really said that?" Lantry asked. "Street corners and rap battles?" "That's what I heard." Neither of them laughed. By seventh period, versions of the story had twisted into all kinds of shapes. Some said Omari had cursed. Others claimed he'd thrown a desk. But those who had been in the room, they knew the truth. Even Mr. Bernal, the janitor who rarely spoke, paused by Omari's locker and said, "You did something right today. That matters." Omari just nodded, and in the guidance office, Zanaya sat beside Miss Glasper on the couch, tissue balled in her hand. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. "No," Miss Glasper said gently. "You didn't, and I'm proud of you." Zania blinked, then looked down. "I just don't want people to think I'm the problem." "They won't," Miss Glasper said, though her voice carried a shadow of doubt. Elsewhere in the school, phones buzzed, teachers whispered, and Ms. Van Holt? She sat in the lounge staring out the window, her lunch untouched. "You know you crossed a line this morning," said Mrs. Coulson, the librarian, sitting 2 seats away. "I was correcting her," Van Holt said flatly. "Number you were revealing something you've never dealt with." She didn't answer, but by the time the final bell rang, the question wasn't whether the school knew. It was what they were going to do about it. Her daughter asked if she sounded ghetto. What happened next shook the whole school. Tanya Brooks sat across from Principal Voss, her tone calm, but thunder lived beneath her words. "I need to know exactly what was said to my daughter," she began, her eyes never leaving his. Principal Voss folded his hands, his posture cautious. "We're still gathering the full context." "The context?" Tanya cut in. "A teacher humiliated my child in front of an entire classroom. You've had her in this school for 2 years. Has she ever been disrespectful? Ever caused a problem?" Voss shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Then tell me, why wasn't she protected?" He hesitated just long enough for the silence to sting. "You're right to be upset." "I'm not upset," Tanya said sharply. "I'm furious, because my daughter came home and didn't want to talk. And when she finally did, she asked me if she sounded ghetto." That word hung in the air like smoke. Voss flinched. Across town at 4:10 p.m., Jabriel Penn got the call. He had just come off the early shift at the post office, still wearing his navy blue uniform, when he stepped into the main office of Pinebrook Junior High. At 6 feet 2 inches, he filled the space just by standing still. His son Omari sat in a chair by the wall, sketchbook in his lap, not drawing, just holding it like something solid. "Mr. Penn, thanks for coming," Voss said with the same tight smile. Jabriel ignored him. He turned to Omari. "You good?" Omari nodded, slow and quiet. "Tell me what happened." Your version, Omari did. The reading, the insult, the silence, the moment he stood. Jabriel didn't interrupt, just stood there, arms crossed, listening like a man who'd heard worse but still refused to let it slide. When Omari finished, Jabriel nodded once. "You proud of what you did?" Omari looked up. "I don't know." "Well," his father said, "I am." Then he turned to Voss, eyes hard as stone. "Let me be clear. My son won't be apologizing for calling out disrespect. If this were the other way around, you would have already sent letters home." "I understand," Voss replied, "and for what it's worth, I agree." "Then what are you doing about it?" That question settled like a weight in the room. Down the hall, Ms. Van Holt sat alone in her classroom. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from a colleague. She didn't open it. Most messages were empty gestures. A few offered vague support. The rest stayed silent. She kept replaying the moment. Zanaya's voice, her own words, Omari standing up. She hadn't meant it that way. That's what she told herself. But no matter how she tried to bend the memory into something forgivable, it kept snapping back into shape. Ugly, clear. And while she rewound the moment again and again, the district office was already moving. 2 official parent complaints and an email from a local reporter asking for comment. The next morning, Pinebrook Junior High felt like a fuse had been lit. There was no announcement, no statement, but the students felt it. So did the staff. Hushed voices, suspicious glances. People didn't stop each other in the halls to say hello. They stopped to trade rumors, to confirm what they thought they heard. By second period, Omari was called to the office. Not over the intercom. A student aide delivered the slip, folded once like it carried a secret. Omari stood slowly, sketchbook under his arm. He walked down the hallway like he already knew what was coming. Outside the principal's office, Zanaya was waiting. She sat upright, ankles crossed, eyes forward. When Omari approached, she didn't look over, but her fingers twitched slightly in her lap. like she wanted to wave, but wasn't sure she should. "Come on in," Voss said. The room was too white, too clean. Even the clock on the wall ticked too loud. On one side of the desk sat Ms. Van Holt. Her arms were folded, a legal pad on her lap with not a single word written on it. Across from her sat Omari and Zanaya. Beside them, their parents, Gabriel Penn and Tanya Brooks. They didn't speak, but their presence was loud enough. "We're here to talk this through," Voss began, hands clasped like he'd practiced this exact moment. "Our goal is to make sure everyone is heard and treated with respect." Tanya didn't blink. Respect would have meant this meeting happened yesterday. "But go on." Voss cleared his throat. "Ms. Van Holt, I think it's best we start with your account." She shifted in her seat. She looked smaller than usual. "I asked Zanaya to read aloud. I felt her tone lacked clarity. I made a poor comment. I was trying to redirect." Tanya cut in. "You compared her to a rap battle." "I did," Van Holt admitted, "and I regret that." "That's not an apology," Jabriel said, his voice like a steady drumbeat. Omari spoke up. "You didn't correct her reading. You mocked her. Loud enough that people could have laughed if they wanted to." Van Holt winced. "That wasn't my intent." "But it was the result," Zanaya finally said. Her voice didn't shake. "You made me feel like I didn't belong here." Silence followed, long enough for everyone to hear the second hand of the clock tick 4 times. Then Principal Voss spoke again. "Ms. Van Holt, this isn't the first time we've received concerns about your language in class. I've reviewed 2 prior complaints." "I wasn't aware they were formal," she said, panic just beginning to creep into her tone. "They were documented," Voss replied, "but this is the first time it's become this serious, and we can't ignore it." She swallowed. "Am I being fired?" "That's not my decision," he said, "but you'll be placed on administrative leave pending a full district review." No one cheered. No one gloated. Tanya let out a slow breath. Jabriel's head tilted slightly. Omari leaned back in his chair, calm, steady, not triumphant, just sure. Zanaya's hands at last relaxed in her lap. Miss Van Holt stood, nodded once, then walked out. The door clicked shut behind her, and in that silence the shift was felt. Not the end of something, the beginning. Principal Voss turned to the family still seated in the room. "I want to sincerely apologize for what's happened," he began. "I'm working with the district to ensure it's addressed the right way. If either of your children needs academic or personal support, we'll provide it." Tanya looked over at her daughter. "Zanaya, you want to go back to class?" Zanaya shook her head. "Not today." Gabriel turned to his son. "Omari?" Omari stared at the wall for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I'll go." The room began to empty, but the tension didn't vanish. Something had shifted. The weight of the conversation still hung in the air, but it was no longer pressing down the same way. Down the hall, the news had already spread. Miss Van Holt was gone. By 4th period, everyone knew. Some said she'd been fired. Others whispered it was just a suspension. A few joked that even if she returned, she wouldn't remember any of their names. But not everyone was laughing. In room 113, Mr. Delvisio's social studies class had barely started the lesson on Reconstruction when he paused, sensing the restlessness. 20 unfocused faces stared back at him. He switched off the projector. "All right," he said, "let's talk about what's actually on your minds." A few heads lifted in surprise. Then Dave, usually the quiet one, raised his hand. "You heard about what happened with Ms. Van Holt, right?" "I did," Mr. Delvisio replied. "I heard she was sent home." "Do you think what she said was racist?" asked Aubrey from the back row. He hesitated, then answered carefully. "I think what she said was harmful. Whether or not she meant it that way, that's how it landed. And when you're in a position of power, how people hear you matters more than what you meant to say." The room grew still. Students nodded, some quietly reflecting. But in the teacher's lounge, the tone was different. Mrs. C.R., who'd been at Pinebrook almost as long as Van Holt, stirred her tea sharply. "Dedra didn't mean it like that," she snapped. "She was trying to make a point. Kids today are just too sensitive." Mr. Lamont, the assistant principal, set his mug down slowly. "This isn't about sensitivity. It's about being spoken to like you're beneath someone. That's not teaching. She's just old school. Strict, that's all, Mrs. C.R. argued. No, Beverly, Mr. Lamont said firmly. She was careless, and this isn't the first time. The room went silent. Ms. Glasper, the school counselor, quietly recalled past incidents. Kennedy, a student who'd once been told she shouldn't aim too high with college plans. Maybe a technical school was more realistic. Van Holt's name had come up then, but Kennedy's mom worked 2 jobs and didn't have time to fight the system. Nothing was ever documented. There was also Caleb, 2 years back, who was asked if that's how they speak at home, after saying ain't during a group discussion. He didn't report it, just transferred out of the class the next semester. These were the stories whispered in corners, one here, another there, never enough to prove a pattern, until now. In the library, Mrs. Coulson pulled old yearbooks from a dusty shelf. She'd been at Pinebrook for nearly 20 years. She'd seen it, the subtle differences. Some students were called bright, others simply well-behaved. The difference always seemed to depend on who their parents were and how they spoke. Back in the front office, Principal Voss stared at an email from the district. Subject line, pending inquiry, classroom incident. Plain words, but he knew better. This wasn't going away. And the real question now wasn't about Miss Van Holt. It was about how many students had sat in classrooms, quietly swallowing comments like that, wondering if they were the problem. In the hallway near the science labs, Zanaya stood at her locker with her friend Joey. "Do you think she'll come back?" Zanaya asked. Joey shrugged. "Does it matter?" "It does to me. She made me feel like I wasn't smart." Zanaya looked down. "I know," Joey said gently, "but maybe it's not about understanding why she did it. Maybe it's about making sure no one else goes through that." Zanaya nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else. But in that silence, something settled. What neither of them knew was that the district had already scheduled a school board meeting for that Friday, and what came next would stretch far beyond the walls of Pinebrook. Friday night. Friday night. The March air in Turut, Indiana was colder than usual. The parking lot outside the VO County School District office filled up well before 6 p.m. Headlights cut through the dusk as parents, teachers, and students made their way into the building. The auditorium buzzed with quiet tension. This wasn't a normal meeting. The back rows were filled with teens in hoodies, sneakers tapping the tile. Parents lined the walls, scanning printed agendas like they held courtroom verdicts. At the front, flanked by her attorney and union rep, sat Miss Deidre Van Holt. Her hair was pulled tight, her shoulders rigid. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her silence said plenty. 2 rows behind, Principal Voss sat alone, face unreadable. Gabriel Penn entered with Omari beside him, both quiet, steady. Tanya Brooks and Zanaya arrived 10 minutes later. Zanaya walked a little slower than usual, but her chin was high. She hadn't said much all day, but being in that room gave her something, a sense of purpose, a reason to stand tall. At 6:15 p.m. sharp, Board Chair Leon Gramley tapped his gavel lightly. "Let's bring this meeting to order." For the first 15 minutes, they stuck to the printed agenda: field trip budgets, textbook approvals, facility repairs. But everyone in the room knew it wouldn't stay on script for long. Nobody was really listening at first. People stared at their phones, whispered quietly to each other, but everyone was waiting for one thing. Finally, it showed up on the agenda. Personnel review, Pinebrook Junior High incident. The grapevine had done its work. Every person in that boardroom knew exactly what that meant. Mr. Gramley, the district superintendent, cleared his throat. "We've received multiple complaints regarding comments made by Miss Van Holt, a teacher at Pinebrook. We're opening the floor now for public comment." The line to speak formed fast. The first to step up was Shelley Byers, a former PTA president. "I've known Dedra for 15 years, she began. "Yes, she's been tough, but she's not a racist. We shouldn't destroy a person's career over one mistake." Some older audience members nodded quietly. Then Karen Willis stepped forward, a black mother of 2. "My son was in her class last year. One day he came home asking if it was wrong that he didn't sound white enough. I let it slide. I shouldn't have." Silence. Next came Mr. Delvicio, a teacher at Pinebrook. "I've worked with her. I've even defended her. But when a pattern appears, we have to listen. We're here to educate, not to decide who gets treated with dignity." Omari's name came up again and again. Some called him brave. Others said he overreacted. A few avoided saying what they really meant, throwing out words like tone, manners, respect. Then Jabriel stood up, Omari's father. He didn't perform, didn't raise his voice. He just said, "My son didn't lie." He didn't yell. He stood up for someone who was humiliated. If that's not what we want our kids to learn, then what are we even doing here? He stepped down before the room could respond. Tanya never spoke. She didn't have to. Zanaya did. She walked up slowly, her voice soft but clear through the microphone. "I don't want Miss Van Holt fired because I hate her. I just don't want to keep shrinking myself so other people feel comfortable. That's all." One person clapped, then another. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. Just enough to say, "We hear you." The board didn't vote that night. They said they'd review all the information, but everyone could feel it. The decision had already begun to write itself. That night, as the crowd walked into the cold, it wasn't the board's choice that mattered most. It was the fact that, for once, the students had been heard. The shift Monday felt different. Not louder, not busier, just aware. When the bell rang at Pinebrook Junior High, students filed in quietly. Hallway conversations were hushed. Teachers looked up more often, not out of fear, but focus, as if everyone remembered just how fragile trust can be in a school. Zanaya took her usual seat in English, third row, but today there was a substitute, Mr. Nielsen, a retired teacher from across town. He greeted the class with a gentle smile. "We'll be reading short stories this week," he said. No one asked where Ms. Van Holt was. They already knew. Zanaya opened her notebook but didn't write. She glanced around. Jovi, scribbling notes in the margins of her folder. Davian hoodie up, headphones half tucked under his collar. And then, Omari wasn't there. Her chest tightened. But a moment later, she saw him through the window, walking past, a late slip in hand. He entered the classroom, handed it to the sub, and sat down quietly without looking at anyone. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Near the end of class, Zanaya raised her hand. "I'd like to read something," she said. Mr. Nielsen nodded. She stood, not with drama, but with purpose, and read a poem she'd written over the weekend. It wasn't about Ms. Van Holt, not directly. It was about voices, the ones people try to shrink, the ones told they're too much, too loud, not the right kind of smart. It was about learning to breathe again after someone's words try to steal the air from your chest. Halfway through, Jovi looked up. By the final line, even Omari had lifted his head. When Zanaya sat down, no one clapped. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. It was the kind of silence that meant people were really thinking. The aftermath. Later that day, Principal Voss visited their class. He thanked the students for how they handled the past week. Then he handed out flyers, student forum, what respect looks like in school. Open discussion next Thursday. Led by students, open to faculty. He said it was optional, but something in his tone said it wasn't just another school event. At lunch, Omari finally spoke to Zanaya. "That poem, it was real," he said. She nodded. "Thanks. I wasn't sure if I should read it." "You did," he replied. "That's what matters." Then quieter. "I don't think I've ever said that much in school before last week." "You shouldn't have had to," she said, "but I'm glad you did." Lunch passed quietly, not with gossip or rumors, but real conversations, the kind students had never felt safe enough to have, until now. In the faculty lounge, a different kind of shift was happening. Ms. Glasper started organizing a session on unconscious bias. Mr. Delvicio volunteered to co-lead. Even teachers who once defended Van Holt were quieter, not silenced but unsure. Somewhere in the district office, Ms. Van Holt's resignation letter sat waiting to be processed. She chose early retirement. The board never had to vote. The pressure had already spoken for them. That afternoon, as students exited to their buses, someone wrote 3 words in chalk near the front steps. "We still matter." It was crooked, barely neat, but clear. More than one moment. What Pinebrook learned wasn't just about one teacher. It was about the hundreds of quiet moments when someone chooses to speak or stays silent. Weeks passed, but something had changed. Zanaya returned to her routine, but it didn't feel routine anymore. She still read her books, still took careful notes, but she didn't lower her voice when she spoke. didn't shrink in her seat, and when teachers called on her unexpectedly, she met their eyes. And when she passed the English room, now led by someone new, she didn't look away. At the first student-led forum, over 50 students showed up. Half didn't say a word, but they were there, listening, witnessing. One by one, they shared how it felt to be corrected more than heard, how it felt to be told their way of speaking was wrong, as if language only belonged to one kind of person. Omari stayed in the back. He hadn't planned to speak, but near the end, someone asked him, "Why did you say something that day?" "I didn't do it for applause," he said. "I said it because no one else did, and because I wanted her to know she wasn't alone." More forums followed, one every month. Faculty started attending. Some stayed quiet. Some asked clumsy questions, but they came. Change didn't look like fireworks. It looked like tough conversations, students correcting teachers and not being punished for it, a school adopting racial sensitivity training and letting students help lead it. In one hallway, a bulletin board went up. Words that matter. Students pinned up phrases they'd heard, some uplifting, many painful. "She speaks well. For a black girl. Are you sure you belong in honors? You're not like the others." Zanya read each one, then added her own. "I don't want to sound ghetto." No name. She didn't need to. Omari stood beside her. "You think they're listening now?" he asked. "Some of them," she replied. "That's a start. A new beginning." That evening, a freshman from another school messaged Omari. He'd seen the story online. Said Omari's words gave him courage to speak up in class. Said he got sent out for it, but he'd do it again. Omari replied, "Do it again. Every time. That's the part they don't teach. The power of your voice. Especially when it shakes. Especially when it's alone. Especially when the room goes silent, but you don't sit back down." Ms. Van Holt never came back. She sent a polite farewell email. No parties, no cake. Just an ending. And a beginning. The district released a generic statement. But Pinebrook didn't need headlines. The story lived in the halls, in students who noticed more, who asked harder questions, who didn't laugh off harmful remarks anymore. In her final writing project of the year, Zanaya titled her essay, "When Someone Finally Stood Up." She didn't name names, but everyone who read it knew exactly who it was about. Her last line read, "I used to think being quiet made me safe. Now I know. It just made other people comfortable." Some stories don't end with justice or clean resolutions, but they start something. And sometimes starting something is the most powerful thing you can do. If you believe stories like Omari's and Zanaya's matter, don't stay silent. Share them. Talk about them. Stand up when it's hardest.